Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Farming Focus, the podcast for South West farmers brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I'm your host, Peter Green. In this episode, we'll be diving deep into a topic that's in most farmers' minds at the moment. Whether you are a landowner or a tenant, it impacts every farm business: succession planning. And of course, the changes to agricultural property relief that came into effect on the 5th of April 2026. Just for context, we're recording this on the 22nd of April. In particular, we'll be exploring how to prepare for succession, how challenges that are common to virtually all businesses and also any that are often overlooked. Then next week in our bonus episode, we will look at the topic of gifting. To help us unpack this, we are joined by Tom Mottram from Porter Dodson Solicitors and Advisors, who will talk us through the legal and tax considerations. And I'm delighted that we're also joined by farmer and co-founder of Ladies in Beef, Jilly Greed. Tom, welcome to the podcast. Can you introduce yourself and your work, please?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, I am a solicitor. I work for a law firm. We are a quote-unquote full-service law firm. So in theory, we can help our clients with all of their various legal needs. But I specialise in helping individuals, families, farms, businesses with their succession planning.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Jilly, welcome to you too. My introduction hardly did justice to all of your various experiences. Please, could you tell us a little bit more about you and your business?
Okay, so I'm a fourth generation farmer, beef producer and arable too. Farming in the Exe Valley near Exeter with husband and son. And I was never destined to farm. So I think the topic that we're going to discuss is quite interesting in terms of succession. I'm also a co-founder of Ladies in Beef and the Great British Beef Week, which actually kicks off tomorrow, although this podcast will come out later. It starts on St. George's Day.
One of the favourite weeks of my year, as those that know me will attest. Thank you very much for that, Jilly. So, Tom, I'm sure most people listening will have a feel for this, but can you outline the specific changes that came into effect on the 6th of April relating to succession? And this is in light of the fact that the terms were changed following an announcement just before Christmas 2025.
Yeah, that's right. It's been a busy and an interesting 18 months or so. And we're talking in the context here of inheritance tax and the tax landscape and the changes in that landscape over that period. Inheritance tax is a fiendishly complex tax as it is. So perhaps it helps to go briefly back to the basics and then explain what's happened in terms of changes. I'll ignore for the moment the fact that, of course, inheritance tax, as we all know, can apply during lifetime. He says flippantly, but on death, what happens when somebody dies is their estate needs to be valued. And in theory, the revenue would like to take 40% of that, is sort of the top level message. It's not quite as horrendous as that because various allowances and exemptions are typically available in the right set of circumstances and if the right things are in place. But crucial here is the concept that traditionally, ultimately, qualifying farms and trading businesses have been protected from tax. They've not been subject to tax. Again, in the right circumstances, if they are qualifying, and that comes with its own set of conditions, they will be fully relievable. And we've already referred to agricultural relief and also business relief. And so farmers and business owners have never had to worry about inheritance tax, really, within the value of the farm and the business assets. And what the Chancellor announced in October 2024 was that she was throwing that out the window and limiting relief in combination, whether that's farming and other business assets, to £1 million per person. I don't need to go into the attention that attracted. There was then a concession before Christmas that she was raising that cap to £2.5 million per person. And again, if the right circumstances are in place and if there's a married couple or civil partners in the business, they can share their allowances, which means that ultimately, if those values do not exceed £5 million, then there shouldn't be tax to pay. The final points to make are that Any value in excess of that is going to be at least 20% tax, though. So it's not going to exempt everybody. And I would just add on to that, that things are going to continue to change for lots of people, not exclusive to farmers and business owners. But as of next year, the tax position will be even more treacherous because pensions will also fall into the tax net. That's a side to side, but it's important for listeners to keep that sort of thing under review with their advisors.
Brilliant. So I take a breath there, Tom, because there's a lot that you've just gone through and you've summarised it brilliantly for us. Thank you. So we're talking about inheritance tax, and people will remember the October 2024 budget that you referenced when there were some big changes. They seemed to come out of the blue somewhat for the farming representative organisations. There was a period then of much disappointment and of people lobbying government, and then in December 25, as you've said, the thresholds were changed to revised upwards. But you've also talked there about the fact that people need to be aware that pensions are going to be taxed in future as well. So there's a lot here to be thinking about and talking about, but a really helpful summary. Thank you. So Jilly, you've heard what Tom had to say there. There is a lot to be thinking about. How do families start to have these conversations?
This is a little bit in the past for us now, apart from now dealing with pensions, because when that budget day announcement happened, I mean, it was like no other, I think, particularly for family farms as well, that have passed down through the generations, a seismic moment. And I think you realise how vulnerable you were if the awful should happen. And although everybody has done with their accountants and solicitors and probably their valuers done some good prep work along the way, all of that was undone in a sense. So I think for us, it was almost immediately a meeting with our accountants and really looking at the liability, and the liability was enormous. And although the increase in the threshold helps, we are still actually caught by what will be a sizable inheritance tax bill, which has shrunk by 1 million, effectively, with an increased threshold. So it's still very top of mind. It, I think, caused a lot of sleepless nights in how to mitigate that. But I think a year on now, we found a way through. We found a way through a structure, got a really good team of professionals who've enabled us to do that with their expertise. There's a humongous professional bill accumulated. So one of the things is actually having available cash to actually be able to settle these as you go along, because they are significant. But I think we've done our very best to protect the farm and for the 5th generation and the 6th and hopefully the 7th. That does mean also that my husband and I need to live 7 years. And we've set up a trust because the land values are just extraordinary. What you get is a return on investment on all the capital that you put in, even machinery assets, livestock assets. This comes now into the equation. All your working bits and pieces come into the equation. It is a really sobering thing. Truly sobering. But I think we're in a better position because we brought forward some things that we were going to do. I mean, one of the things I think is really important, which you may touch on later, is actually having a really good partnership agreement. And thankfully that was in place. And that has kind of been, in a sense, the kind of working document on how you manage those valuable assets, particularly of land. Instead of meeting annually to kind of put this succession planning, which is always on the agenda, in readiness for the year end, we meet effectively quarterly now, and it's still there. And I think it's positive to do it in the professional accountancy environment. So we're really aware of the liability and the risks.
So that quarterly meeting, is that something that was initiated to start this conversation, which was where we started this conversation, and that's something that the business has chosen to continue, or is that sort of a management accounts meeting? If you don't mind me asking, and please feel free not to answer, what form does that quarterly meeting take?
It'll involve management accounts, it'll involve year end, it'll involve trust discussion, but it actually is a key point on the agenda in terms of distribution of assets.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. So, Tom, we've heard a bit about Jilly's experience there and some of the things which have been put in place. What sort of questions are you getting from your clients? Are they doing similar sorts of things to those that we've heard Jilly talking about? What do they want to know generally about succession?
Yeah, I mean, Jilly demonstrates firsthand there, doesn't she? The impact that this has had on people and how much attention they've had to give to it. It's such a serious change to the way in which businesses are operating. And broadly speaking, the first types of questions were, Tom, do we need to come and see you? How does this impact us? Do we need to be giving the business away? Those very broad questions. And you think, we need to sit down and go through this carefully. I'm afraid you do need a few advisors in your life, probably starting with me and your accountant, as Jilly's already alluded to. Can't have enough advisors in your life. Everybody knows that.
Spoken like a true solicitor.
I'm very aware that my time should be mitigated, and I'm fine with that. The truth is that would then lead on to the types of questions that we were already having, which preceded the changes, which are it could be in any manner of nature and format, because it's all specific to the business and the family in the particular case. But traditionally, we have lots of questions about, okay, even if we are going to succession plan now, specifically, we might have more than one in the next generation, but only one is interested in the business. How are we going to divide this? We might want to do things now, but how do we protect our legacy? How do we protect the business in the future? So all these sorts of questions come into that sort of estate planning exercise, that conversation, and we address it and see what people are comfortable with. What is it you're trying to achieve? How do we achieve that? What are the implications of achieving that? And a proper planning exercise can ensure that everybody's on the same page so that we can do that in a successful way.
Okay, so what do we want to achieve, and how are we going to do that? Would I be right in suggesting that with these sorts of conversations, all of the people that need to be in the room aren't always in the room? So there may be stakeholders from the different businesses that you're working with that aren't fully engaged in the process. How do you make sure they are engaged, and how do you make sure that the communication with them can be positive and constructive?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, I write a lot of wills, and traditionally the films show the will reading, don't they, to the family, and that's the first anybody ever hears of it. And we know how that goes in the films. Nobody is ever pleased. It's always surprise, confusion, upset. Somebody usually throws a vase at somebody, however that goes down. So it's more important than ever to completely forget that approach. And as far as I am concerned, myself and my colleagues as well, we always try to insist that as a family, as a business, all those stakeholders are involved in that from the outset, and that communication and openness is part of the exercise to make sure that there are no. I mean, I'd take a family I'm dealing with recently, very large farming estate, and parents just have been so reluctant. It's very British of them. There's a sort of generational reluctance as well to have this conversation. And so they've been putting it off and putting it off. It turns out it's not really because they don't understand the importance of it or the tax implications if they don't do this succession planning, but simply because they haven't had that conversation with their son. Their son has other business interests. Their daughters don't want to farm. And so they have been worried about his willingness or his ability to take on the farm. And son has been unwilling to pressure parents into having that conversation. So actually, it was a frank, it's not even really a lawyer's point, it's just getting people in the room and saying, what are the issues? Where do you need reassurance? What has not been said? And blaming the solicitor, even if you find it, if you do find that uncomfortable, you can blame the solicitor for forcing you into that conversation. And that's allowed them to break down those barriers and to progress with their succession planning. So that's really key, communication between the family, as well as communication with the right types of advisors to make sure that you understand all that needs to be in place and understand the implications of what you're going to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a danger sometimes that we can assume what other people think and feel. And there's a danger, I know that I'm guilty of this sometimes, of just sticking our head in the sand, that ostrich effect. Jilly, I saw you nodding there when Tom was speaking. Does any of what Tom said resonate with your experience?
Well, very much with my late father, who actually in a sense, didn't have the courage to deal with his affairs before he had a terminal illness. And his letter of wishes, which did indicate that actually he wanted the farm to continue, or the land to continue to be farmed, and especially with his grandson, and this is our son George in the partnership, the letter of wishes was left around on his kitchen table for me to read. I have to say, though, the experience of leaving his affairs like he did was a terrible burden on the executors. It caused enormous family friction to non-farming brother and sister. And I think more than anything, the sheer futility and the cost of it. So there was a massive tax liability as well, which had to be dealt with. And it took 4 years before actually the assets were transferred. So it was a terrible, painful experience. So I do agree in part with what Tom has said, but I know how difficult it is. I have some understanding for my father. He wasn't at all well. But I feel it is a duty of care on our part not to leave the kind of legacy that he did. Because at times it's so painful, even now, 14 years on, to actually process it. And you forget about all that he achieved in his life as a farmer. And then at the last, it was disastrous. And he thought he could live forever.
That's such a powerful thing to share. Thank you very much, Jilly. The piece around legacy is just burning through at me there. What is it that we want to leave? How do we want to be remembered ourselves? How do we want the business to go on and to proceed? I think in my experience from speaking to people about this, one of the most difficult things when we're talking about succession, and part of it is that word succession. I know that in Ireland, certainly there are people who prefer to think about it as transition or regeneration. Give it a different name, because succession has connotations of people leaving and exiting a business. And I think by default, some people feel that necessarily means death. And I think another thing about this, and it sounds like that's something which maybe comes into your father's situation, Jilly, was that it's a very difficult thing to think about at the best of times. And I'm speaking from personal experience, having to deal with this in one's later years, when it's less comfortable to think about perhaps, and perhaps there are less people to support you, it can make it even more difficult. So for me, that really underlines the importance of trying to get affairs in order as early as possible. Start that conversation as early as possible. And we can always revisit it like you're doing, Jilly, but just leaving it doesn't feel like a sensible thing to do. Tom, does that sound sensible to you? Does that reflect your experience? And I guess leading on from that, where should farmers be starting? What paperwork should they be getting in place now?
It's an all too familiar experience of mine. And I think you're right, both of you. The word legacy is the key thing here. You've worked so hard to operate in fiendishly difficult circumstances to make the business a success. And then for whatever reason, it becomes so difficult to allow the next generation to prosper. And we really do need to work to try and break that down for whatever reason, wherever that reluctance has come from, whether that's just because of habit or because of a reluctance to work with advisors. There's a lot for my side of things to make us, I suppose, more accessible, more approachable. I like working with people. That's why I'm in what I'm in. But it's so important, and hopefully it's only going to improve. But to come on to your question about where do you start? Well, actually, Jilly can do my job for me, really, because she started me off by talking about business documentation, the structure of the business, the partnership agreement, or in some limited cases, the company constitutional documentation. Really, really important to have that in place. And we see all too frequently that is not in place, or it is inadequate. And perhaps we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. I can reel off a list, but we would always go through this when sitting down with the individuals. But just things like making sure that those documents which evidence ownership are up to date. Where are your deeds? Do the land registry know about your deeds? Are they in everybody's name? Are the borders all, are the lines all drawn in the right place? Of course, have you got your wills in place? Have you looked at them since 1982? Things change over time. Taxes, rules, practices change over time. Does it state who you want to as well as confirming how you want things to be passed on when you've died? Does it state things like your funeral wishes? We do see people fall out over funeral wishes where there's no guidance in there. Have you chosen the right people to be dealing with things? What if, heaven forbid, this is nice and cheerful, I'm afraid, folks. What if, heaven forbid, you are still alive, but you've had an accident or an illness, you've lost mental capacity? Have you got your powers of attorney in place? You might have a history of gifting, having taken advice. Have you kept adequate records for that? Because it's all very well us claiming that you've done it, but Mr. Revenue sat at his desk is going to want to see the records. The benefit I always find, or I've very much found at least, we have a team for when families or business owners fall out, and it's really important that if you've seen an advisor, they will always record detailed notes of all correspondence and meetings. So as soon as somebody says or alleges perhaps that somebody was being pressured to make a decision, or perhaps somebody didn't understand a decision, that can be refuted by the professional's record of all meetings and correspondence. That's really helpful as well, just as a point of documentation. But also things like, we will have some of my clients have said in the past, I'd like to pass things on now, but I'm slightly worried that if my daughter then divorces, what happens? So you might put documentation in place there to try and cover that. Families have made agreements in the past where they say, we fully recognise that there is going to be an imbalance in the succession, and we promise not to fall out over it. Whether that's a legal document or otherwise, a family charter, I should say, to demonstrate that in 2026 we all agreed this. Everybody, you can't go back on it now. And then finally, sounds a bit basic, but when you die, your executors, your loved ones, need to know what you have, perhaps outside of the farm. You might have a list of your savings or investments, or I don't know, the Picasso in the basement. There may be a list somewhere. It might be on your laptop. Have they got access to your laptop? Do they know your password? So just these things to try and make life easier for everybody. And that's all, again, down to legacy.
So really helpful. Thank you, Tom. We spoke earlier about friction after someone has died. It's obviously an emotional time, and there can be friction for the parties that are left. Jilly, Tom's given us some really great pointers there, some different documents that we need to get in place, and having those can ease friction. Were there any of those documents that were more or less easy to get sorted, whether they were drafted afresh, or just given a refresh, or they were brand new, or it was just something that you had to go and find? What worked for you? What was difficult for you?
Are you talking about now or in the past?
So when you went through the process that you've been through with your family of sort of getting things sorted, what documents were particularly helpful? You mentioned earlier the partnership agreement, but were there other things which were easier or more difficult to get together to make sure that everyone knew the direction of travel?
I think it was the partnership agreement, because that has been the most fundamental in terms of what the liability and the removal of inheritance, the removal of APR and BPR. So that has been really critical to get that right. It's almost like blocks. You go through blocks. Then the wills are now being sorted out, including that really important power of attorney and having that in place. And the next one will be the pension to deal with that. I mean, if there's a silver lining in all of this tax business and this government and this chancellor and this treasury, sorry to preface it with this, because I do feel not exactly impartial towards them, I do think it has been a useful, express train to get your affairs sorted. And there is some relief in that, I have to say. I mean, when we went for some months, kind of not knowing how it might be, hoping that, circumstances might change, the marches, the tremendous work that the NFU did and other organisations, the CLA, in bringing political pressure on this. And I don't think it was until the Minette Batter's profitability review on that core of farms and how the impact would be, and also the impact that will be on, widowers who are still there, who've lost their spouse. Tremendous. And the elderly, and those actually given a terminal diagnosis, terrible. terrible cost. Truly, the mental health element of it, I think, for the farming industry has been huge. And indeed, the Farm Community Network and others have spoken hugely about that. And thankfully, that there was some recognition before December that has helped. But for some, and particularly the bigger commercial farms that are diversified, it put a complete block. Just to give an example, we have created professional offices here, and we were going to do a further phase. We stopped that immediately because it was just adding to the asset. We just said, right, we're just going to go 12 months and we'll do nothing. We'll do nothing. And it was it was a very negative thing. And I think that's the first time actually in our farming career with George that we've ever made that decision. We're not doing it. Why are we going to actually create an asset for which there is demand and then find that actually it becomes a liability?
Yeah, that would have been certainly a very tricky situation, and one that I think actually a lot of businesses found themselves in. I know that we were thinking quite a similar thing. Why would I increase the value of my asset now if all that's going to happen is that we're going to get taxed on it? It's been a very difficult time, and as you suggest, that time between October 2024 and December 2025 was particularly difficult and stressful for many in the industry. And we are fortunate that there are so many groups who can help, particularly when things get difficult. But it would be great if we don't need things to get to that pass when in the first place. I'm conscious of time, and we're going to have to bring this episode to a bit of a close. But I'd like to ask both of you, and Tom, I'll come to you first, for just some tips and advice, and maybe sort of distill it into a top 3 of things that people can be doing and thinking about to get started in this area, please.
Well, I'll pick up my drum and bang it again about the partnership agreement and support Jilly on that, just because listeners will recognise, I'm sure, that so many farms and businesses will operate based on a structure that's evolved over time, informal arrangements and agreements that have just worked for them. And of course, they've worked extremely hard to make a success of that. But it's not been a result of any strategic, intentional planning. Because why would it happen yet? You're not thinking about that at the time, are you really? You're thinking about making it a success, but it's overlooked, and there's no reason why the partnership agreement should be so important. So it doesn't spring to mind. It's almost like the biggest secret in all of this. At times, it's so important to make sure that it allows, as Jilly talks about, effective running. Continuity, the most basic level. If you don't have a proper partnership agreement in place, then when one of the partners dies, the whole business can freeze. And also, it's extremely important, as Jilly again has touched upon, in demonstrating or entitling the farm, attracting that valuable relief. The second point, perhaps I'm banging a slightly smaller drum. The second tip, is to get the family involved. Your advisor, you expect your advisor to know what they're talking about. So to some extent, that can be assumed, but having the involvement of the family is the other part of this, which allows for it to be so effective. And to just really try to engage with it and don't put it off. A bit of time now to invest in it. To take the time to understand what's involved will really allow for effective planning to secure that legacy. And as I say, allow the next or your successors to prosper as you've done.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's really clear, Tom, and really helpful. Jilly, over to you. What would your real tips and advice be as someone who's walked this walk?
Number 1 is about relationships. So it's having real unity, I think, between those that are custodian of the assets at the moment and the passing of those. So that first, those conversations, which may be over a cup of tea or gin and tonic, and they are crystal clear about what you want to see. So that vision, I think, is really important. And I suppose it'd be fair to say that Ed and I, husband and I, have done that quite clearly. So we're very unified on that. It's perhaps when you don't have that unified approach that can actually lead to some problems later on. The one person we haven't mentioned, or the institution that we haven't mentioned, is the bank. So if you have borrowings, which pretty much every commercial business will have, make sure you have that great relationship with your bank manager, relationship manager, and clearly with the farming team, because when it comes to some legal documents, and I'm thinking about the trust work that we had to do, you will need to have approvals on those loans and any partnership involvement in the trust. So that's a really critical one, and it can take much, much longer than you think, particularly if you're up a deadline to do it by, as we had in this situation, the April 26th date. So that's the last, and the last one is, well, actually, I've got 4. So and that's okay. Get that professional team around you. It's worth asking some other farmers, perhaps, that you respect, who they might be using, who are really on the ball, who are aware of structures, who are aware of ways how you can achieve what you want. And that, obviously, as we said before, is accountants and solicitors and valuers. Don't forget the Red Book valuation as well, which is good, and your bank manager. And then I think my last one is actually of hope. I have had some points where I've really despaired about this, the injustice of it. I do feel that. And we pay tax, happily, like everything. But I think there is, given the low return and how how much you have to invest in your farm to make it sustainable. There is a way through. There's always a way through. And if you can work with others to help you get there, there's enormous peace of mind. And we're still on that journey. But you've done your best. You've done your very best in the circumstances.
Thank you so much, Jilly. I really like that final point that there is a way through, and that it may take time. It's not going to happen in one, but if you put enough time and effort into it, and to Tom's point, if you invest the time early to understand, then it can really lead to really effective outcomes. Wonderful. Thank you so much to my guests today for a brilliant conversation, to Jilly Greed and to Tom Mottram. It's been fantastic to have you both on, and we look forward to speaking to you next week for the bonus episode.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
After that fantastic conversation, it's time for this week's showstoppers, and there's certainly plenty to go at. The first thing that really comes to mind from the conversation that we just had is that we mustn't delay. Jilly talked about legacy and about reducing friction for those that are left behind. And actually, the time to be spending a lot of emotion and effort on getting our estates in order and ready for that transition is not when we are at the end of our life and we're tired. It's much, much sooner. And that gives us the opportunity to think ahead, to consider different scenarios, and to speak to people that are going to be affected. The second thing that I think is really important that has come out loud and clear today is the need to speak to professionals, but not to just speak to 1 or 2 professionals, getting a team that's on your side, people that can surround you and can bring their own particular expertise, that understand your situation and can work together. So it might be a solicitor, an accountant, a financial advisor, a surveyor. There's a number of different people that we might need to involve. And yes, we know that it can feel like something we don't want to do, that we don't want to have to spend that much money on professional fees, but what we spend on professional fees can help to outweigh the potential liability that we can save. And finally, we heard actually a lot about paperwork and getting our paperwork in order. And this isn't something which many of us will rush to, but actually this is something that we can do once and then it's out of the way, certainly for at least a year until we need to review documents or think again. But make sure that there are wills in place. Make sure that there are powers of attorney in place. Make sure that if it's relevant for your business, you have a partnership agreement or articles for your business. And also, Tom talked about asset details, so listing out your bank account so that your partner knows what you've got and where it is. I've got a 1-pager in the top of my desk that my wife can go to so that she knows who to call if the worst were to happen, so that she doesn't have to be thinking about difficult decisions that need making at a time that is already difficult enough. So it's not an easy subject. There's lots to think about, but those are 3 things that it's worth bringing front and centre.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Sadly, that's all we've got time for today's episode. A big thank you to my guests today, to Tom Mottram and Jilly Greed. We would love to hear from you with any feedback that you have about the podcast or questions or suggestions of things that you'd like to know more about. Send us an email to podcast@cornishmutual.co.uk. Check out the show notes for more information on today's episode, including the link to our podcast disclaimer. You've been listening to Farming Focus, brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I've been Peter Green. Until next time, it's goodbye from me and everyone in the Cornish Mutual podcast team.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.